Welcome to Midweek Multiplied, everybody. I want to recap where we've been so far this year in our study. So we saw that there was creation, that God created everything that exists. And because of human beings' selfishness, sin entered the world and stained these relationships, these three primary relationships that kind of are indicated in Genesis, that our relationship with God, our relationship with other human beings, and our relationship with the world around us. So sin stained those relationships, and the world goes through this kind of crazy spiral, and it seems like our situation is hopeless. But then a man called Abraham, who is pretty seemingly insignificant, enters the scene in Genesis, and God says somehow that the whole world, that all nations will be blessed through this human being. So God says that to Abraham, and we see Abraham, his family grow into a nation, the Israelites. They're oppressed and they're enslaved in Egypt, but then God delivers them and brings them out of slavery and frees them. And because of sins of their own, they're made to wander in the desert for 40 years. And so they finally finish this 40 years, and we've seen that they get into the promised land, and all was supposed to be right. God's chosen people was in the land that they were promised, and it was supposed to be this time of prosperity. But in the book of Judges, we saw that it was this endless cycle of chaos. And so we are finishing up this period of Judges this week with the last judge, and we're going to be in the book of 1 Samuel. And I'm so excited for you guys. Honestly, this is why I love the Old Testament. So first off, primarily the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel are going to be dominated by three individuals. So it's going to be Samuel, Saul, and David. And the best thing about the Old Testament, this is why I love it so much, is that it doesn't just tell you the lesson. It doesn't tell you what you're supposed to get from the story. But God reveals himself through stories, and that's what we're going to be looking at this week. So I want you to buckle up, because this is an amazing lesson where we get to learn about God, what God is like, and what ourselves, and how this applies to our life through stories this week. So the story of 1 Samuel opens up with a tale about this guy named Elkanah. And instead of it really being a story about Elkanah, it's more of a story about his wife. And actually, Elkanah had a couple of wives. So one of his wives' name was Peninnah, and then the other one's name was Hannah. And so just like we talked about last week in Ruth, God has been using sinful, messed up, broken situations and individuals and cultures this whole time to accomplish his purposes. So I want to say this from the outset, that just because God has chosen to reveal himself in a specific time, in a specific place, and in a specific culture, it doesn't mean that he approves of everything about that culture. And so as we're thinking about this story, I want you to keep that in mind. So as we look at Hannah and Peninnah was able to have children. She had children, but Hannah was barren. And so the story then focuses in on Hannah. And for some reason, the narrator records a couple of prayers that Hannah prays. And so I think that's the narrator, the writer of this story's way of saying, there's something that we can learn from this woman's faith. There's something that we can learn from her prayers. And so her first prayer, she prays in front of this priest named Eli. I want you to put that in your back pocket and remember that name, because he's going to come up later. So in this first prayer, Hannah asks God to remove her infertility. She says, God, give me a son. So Hannah says, if you give me a son, God, I will give him back to you. I will devote him to you. And so later we're going to find out that God does answer her prayer, and she gives her son back to service for the Lord. And he ends up working in this sanctuary in this city called Shiloh. So she is blessed with this child, and then she returns this blessing back to God and devotes him to God's service. And this son's name is Samuel. And it's this amazing little part of the story that's recorded in this prayer. And so after she has this son, God hears her, he answers her prayer, and she actually does take him to this sanctuary and dedicates him to the Lord's service. We get a second prayer that she prays. And so in this second prayer, it hits on a number of levels. And it's really, really cool. So not only does it reveal kind of the raw feelings of a woman who has gone through infertility and really just someone who has gone through a really hard situation, have their prayer answered by God. It records that for us, but it also reveals and highlights God's track record for caring for people who are down and out, people who are oppressed, people who are broken in spirit. And it's this really amazing prayer, just how God takes care of vulnerable people. But then it takes even this prayer even in a new direction, and it talks about how despite how the world is so messed up, we got a messed up world with messed up people and messed up situations, that God is in the background working things out to accomplish his purposes. And it even mentions, it kind of winks ahead and foreshadows the coming king, that there's going to be a king that comes that will take part of these purposes of God being accomplished. And so in this prayer that's really beautiful, Hannah prays and says that basically true security is going to come from this king who is under divine protection, divine supervision. And so this search for this king is really going to occupy the rest of 1st and 2nd Samuel. And so for today, for our purposes, I just want to ask you, what do you think that the narrator, what do you think that the story wants us to get from looking at Hannah's prayers and reading Hannah's prayers? So this next episode in the story introduces some new characters. So we saw Eli, this priest at Shiloh who Hannah prays in front of, and she even dedicates her son, and she leaves him at this sanctuary at Shiloh where Eli is a priest. So Eli also has 2 sons named Hophni and Phinehas. And a great piece of biblical advice here, never trust anyone named Hophni or Phinehas. And so the story portrays these guys as extremely corrupt. They are also priests at the sanctuary, and they're essentially stealing from people and interrupting really the meat. When people came to sacrifice at this sanctuary, they're interrupting this process, so they would come in and they would essentially take the meat from the sacrifice in the middle of the process. So it's almost like they had these rituals to God, these very solemn rituals, and in the middle of it, they're like, "Hey man, give me my T-bone," sort of thing from your sacrifice. So it was this way that they were just basically abusing their power, and so they would do that, and then they would also they were sleeping with the girls that were also working in the sanctuary. So at the very least, it was sexual misconduct, but at the very worst, they were sexual predators using their power and abusing their power in that way at the sanctuary. And so this is a complete misuse and abuse of power here. And because of this abuse of power, this led to 2 prophecies against Eli and his sons. So the very first, I want to read this. This is in chapter 2, verses 27 through 29 of 1 Samuel. It says this: "Now a man of God came to Eli and said to him, 'This is what the Lord says. Did I not clearly reveal myself to your father's house when they were in Egypt under Pharaoh? I chose your father out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to go up to my altar, to burn incense, and to wear an ephod in my presence. I also gave your father's house all the offerings made with fire by the Israelites. Why do you scorn my sacrifice and offering that I prescribed for my dwelling? Why do you honor your sons more than me by fattening yourselves on the choice parts of every offering made by my people of Israel?'" So this critique that this man of God brings down on Eli and his sons, this is anchored in the story of the Exodus and God revealing himself, and he's saying, "You are my priest." This prophecy is saying, you are God's priest. You were supposed to represent God to the people, and you are failing. And not only are you failing, you're abusing your power. And this abuse of power is ingratitude and irreverence towards God, but it's also breaking the trust of the people. And this is not acceptable to God. This betrayal of trust and this misrepresenting of Him. And so this has to do with integrity. This has to do with honesty amongst leaders and then powerful institutions, powerful positions. So I don't know if you guys have been keeping up with what's going on with GameStop, what's going on with like all hedge fund managers, and also with Robinhood. So if you know what I'm talking about, the memes are 10 out of 10 would recommend. So as you're tracking this situation, there's a lot of hilarious stuff that comes out of it, but I think there is one principle that we can agree on. Like all of us, us right now, all of America, I think for the most part, we want high standards for people in power. We want high standards to be, we want them to be highly accountable if they have positions of authority and positions of power. And I think that through this text we see that God does too. We want people to be held accountable. We want people to be held to a high standard if they have a lot of power, if they have a position of authority. And so God wants that too. I hope you see that in this story. God goes on to say that I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who will do according to what is in my heart and mind, and I will firmly establish his house, and he will minister before my anointed one always. And then in this next section enters this young boy Samuel. Remember, this is Hannah's son, and he's been at this sanctuary at Shiloh, and he appears again. And so also in this section, it talks about in those days, the word of the Lord was rare and there were not many visions. So it's almost like God has gone silent. But here, God breaks his silence and he speaks to Samuel for two reasons. So the first reason really is he's affirming Samuel. He's calling Samuel as his prophet. And in this I just love this phrase. Whenever he calls to Samuel, Samuel says, "Here I am." I just really like that phrase, "Here I am." It's almost like he's presenting myself here. What is it, Lord? What can I do? And so the first reason that God breaks his silence in this era is to speak to Samuel and affirm him as prophet. And then number two, and this is where it gets super interesting and deep and really hard. So for us, I want you to hear this. He tells Samuel that he needs to prophesy against Eli and his house, Eli and his two sons and what they've been doing. And so I want you to think about that from Samuel's perspective. This had to be a guy that he looked up to in the sanctuary, that he was an older man, a priest. And so it was almost probably like a mentorship. And so he has to prophesy, and he reaffirms all the things that the man of God prophesied against Eli and his sons, that he was going to bring them down because of the injustice. And he says, the time is now. Samuel, you need to tell Eli that this is going to happen now. And so that God is going to bring judgment on this house because, and this is an important part, it's going to happen because of the injustices of Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, but also because Eli knew what they were doing and he said nothing. That Eli knew these things were going on and he said nothing, he did nothing. And so this section reveals the character of God. That these priests didn't live up to their role, and so they were going to be tossed out. They were going to be overthrown. So in Samuel, God speaks and God breaks his silence because God sees an abuse of power and an abuse of position here. And he says, you can't be passive whenever there's this abuse of power in my sanctuary. And so if you're tired of injustices in the church, if you're tired of seeing church scandals with church leaders in positions of power doing abominable things, whatever those things may be, if you're tired of seeing that, I hope you see this section in 1 Samuel. God is tired of that too. And God does not take a passive approach. So if God breaks his silence of this long period of silence, it's to affirm Samuel as a prophet, but it's also to speak out against the injustices that God sees. And so what does that mean for us as followers? What does that mean for us as followers of God? So this is when the story starts to get really juicy, and here's what happens next. So the Israelites go out to fight in battle against the Philistines. And so they go out and they're absolutely crushed. 4,000 of their men are killed. So 4,000 guys die. And they're like, okay, well, we're going to break out our secret weapon, the Ark of the Covenant. So they break out the Ark of the Covenant. They parade it around. The Philistines are extremely intimidated. But then they lose to them in battle, and it's an even more crushing defeat. This time, the Israelites were absolutely slaughtered, and 30,000 of their men die in battle. And what's crazy is, in reference back to the prophecy that we were just talking about, Eli's sons, both of them died during this slaughter, really. And even whenever he learns of this crushing defeat that Israel has just suffered and that his sons are dead, he even dies upon hearing that news. So it's just this huge, utter defeat of the Israelites. But the worst possible thing, the worst imaginable disaster happens in the process of this defeat as well. The Philistines capture the Ark of the Covenant. It's taken by them. So you may be thinking Indiana Jones, if you've seen that movie, if you're thinking Ark of the Covenant. But remember, this is this gorgeous, this beautiful chest that's covered by gold. And on top of it are these kind of two sphinx-like figures that are called cherubs. But what is important that you know, and not so much the ornateness, is that this represents the throne of God. This is where God is seated. And more importantly, this is God's presence with us. That's why it was so important. So if they steal that, then I guess you can already kind of put the pieces of the puzzle together if you're a little Sherlock Holmes. If they took that, does that not mean that God is not with us anymore? So when the ark was taken, it's like God is absent. God is gone. God has left us. And it's this terrible, terrible defeat that they are crushed and God is not amongst them anymore. So the Philistines take the Ark of the Covenant back to one of their own towns, and they even put it in a temple of this god called Dagon. So they put it in the temple of Dagon next to this huge statue of Dagon. And so whenever the priest of Dagon, these Philistine priests, come into the temple of Dagon, they see the next morning that this statue is essentially decimated. It's fallen, it's broken, and then also God breaks out a plague against the people of that city as well, and he brings rats and tumors. So the temple of this false god is destroyed, and then the people are inflicted by this plague from God. And so it's this crazy narrative, this crazy scene of this defeat, and then the ark being hauled off. And so what are we to make of this all? So I hope that you are getting so much from these stories, you're reading them yourselves, but I can't help but make this point here because it is so clear, and I really don't want you to miss this one. This is pretty clearly saying that God doesn't need an army to gain victory. And so as you're kind of critical thinking, I hope you are so far as we've looked into these stories, what are we to make of this? You're saying God doesn't need an army to gain victory. I hope that you're thinking back to things I've said several times throughout this study. Essentially, that it's not God that fits into human being stories. It's us that fits into God's story. And it seems to be making a pretty clear point in this one that God is not to be used as a secret weapon. God is not to be used by people for our own selfish gain and our own purposes. So after God brings down the statue of Dagon and also inflicts plagues on the Philistines, they kind of shuffle the Ark of the Covenant around cities, the Philistine cities for a little bit, and then they eventually return it to the Israelite people, so the Ark comes back. But it isn't until years later that there's kind of this reawakening amongst the Israelites to return back to the Lord. And so years later, in this reawakening, here's what Samuel says when people begin to seek the Lord again. This is chapter 7, verse 3. It says, "And Samuel said to the whole house of Israel, 'If you are returning to the Lord with all your hearts, then rid yourselves of the foreign gods and Ashtoreths, and commit yourselves to the Lord, and serve Him only, and He will deliver you out of the hand of the Philistines.'" And so in essence, he's saying, remove the foreign gods, remove the idols from your lives, the things that hold your attention, your devotion, your love. Remove those things from your life so that I can save you, that I can rescue you. So it's this amazing statement in chapter 7, verse 3. And so the people they destroy the idols. And as a whole people, they mourn their sin, they lament their sin, and they confess their sins, that they have strayed away. And it's this beautiful picture of their return back to God as their God. And so God then gives them a victory over the Philistines in battle, reaffirming His presence among them. And so He brings prosperity and success back to this people, the Israelites, as long as Samuel lives, essentially. And Samuel was considered a judge over him for the rest of his life. And so as we draw to a close here, I think a very low level of reading of this story, you could see, or you could say that if we are good, God will give us what we want. If we're good, God will bless us. But please see this. I hope that you saw this in the story, that God isn't this magic genie to be used for your own gain or your own profit and your own purposes. God has a plan, and He is working in the world, and that we are just a part of that plan. I hope that you saw that. He doesn't have to use you. In the story of Him being, the Ark of the Covenant and His presence being brought to the temple of Dagon, He doesn't have to use you. He can accomplish victory on His own. But what's amazing, and I think this reveals the character of God, is that He may choose to use you. He may choose to use human beings to accomplish His purposes. And that reveals the character of God. And I hope that in this story, little things have spoken to you, like Samuel saying, "Here I am. God, I don't know if you want to use me, but I want you to use me. Here I am." And so I want to draw our attention back as this story started with Hannah. And really Hannah, this woman that we see her prayers, is the unsung hero of this whole thing. And the phrase that comes to mind is blessed to bless. And so Hannah, she asked God for a child because she's barren. But then she says, "God, if you give me this child, I want this child to be for your purposes. I want this child to be dedicated to you." She is blessed. She's asking for blessing so that others might be blessed, so that God's name might be glorified. And is that not our original purpose that we've studied all year long? That Adam and Eve, they were human beings, that we were created in God's image so that we could show the rest of the world, human beings could show the rest of the world what God was like, that we are His image bearers, His representatives. So it started with Adam and Eve, and then we see it reaffirmed in Abraham. Abraham is this man that God chooses, and He says, "Through you, Abraham, there is hope, because all nations somehow will be blessed through you." That Abraham is blessed by God so that the rest of humanity can be blessed. And that extends to the whole nation of Israel. Whenever God makes a covenant with them, He says, "You're going to be my nation of priests," which a priest, there's a lot of connotations with that. that these days. But priests are simply representatives of God's. They represent God to the people, and people can speak to these priests and communicate back to God. And so this nation of priests is blessed by God, chosen by God, the Israelites, so that they could represent God to the rest of the world. And so it all connects back that we are blessed so that we can bless. And I hope that you see that extends to you. Certainly if you are a Christian, that you are in Abraham's family, that you are by extension an Israelite, and you are blessed to bless. And so this, I hope that you're hearing this, that Jesus is not Santa Claus, that God is not Santa Claus. He's not the genie or a lamp that you rub so that you can get the things that you want in your life. Blessing is not a reward for faithfulness either. Because God, it says, He will send rain on the righteous and unrighteous. And that's a biblical verse basically saying that good things happen to good people and bad people. But for us, for our purposes today, I want you to hear that it's what we do with those blessings. As the people of God, we're supposed to take those blessings and represent God well to the rest of humanity. And so as we conclude, I want to ask you some questions, and this genuinely is why I love the Old Testament so much. There were so many different things that we could get from these 7 chapters today from 1 Samuel. But what is speaking to you? What do you guys need to discuss as a group? So I want to ask you a question from each of the sections that we talked about today. And then you guys dig in and dive in for how this applies to you in your life and what you need to hear. So the first is from that section of Hannah. So what does it look like to pray and ask God to bless you so that you can use those blessings to serve others? What does that look like for you in your life? Practically, real, like in a real way. From the section on the sons of Eli, these corrupt priests, why does the misuse of power bother us? And this is going to sound really basic, but I hope you dive deep into this. Why does the misuse of power bother us? And why is the misuse of power wrong? Why do we consider that wrong? From the section on Samuel pronouncing judgment on Eli and his sons, when Samuel's called and then he has to pronounce that judgment, what injustices do you see in the world? And why do you think they're injustices? And then what responsibility do we have as Christians to stand against those injustices and call them out? And what does that look like maybe? From the section on the ark when it's stolen by the Philistines, this is a good one. What does it practically mean for you to fit our story into God's story instead of the other way around? So I hope that comes through clear. So what does it mean for you to be a part of God's story instead of trying to fit God into your life story? What does that practically mean, and what does that look like for your life? And then the last one, this reawakening and repentance of the whole nation of Israel. What would it look like for you to get rid of the idols in your life? What idols do you have that compete for your attention and your love before God? And what would it look like for you to get rid of those idols? So thank you guys for watching today. I hope you have an awesome discussion. Love you guys.